What does it mean to be a good sequel? Does it mean expanding and elaborating on the lives of the characters? Does it mean continuing an ongoing story in a satisfactory way? Does it just mean continuing on the mechanical legacy of the game that came before? Can a game do absolutely none of these things and still be considered a good sequel? Saints Row III is the most popular game in the series by a huge margin, but it's also incredibly singular. A sequel that changes almost everything between games except for the genre, to the point where to this day there is a faction of fans who don't even consider this to be a real sequel to Saints Row 2. It's easy to see where they're coming from, because Saints Row III is a very different game with very different creative aspirations. Really, it's all in the name. It's not Saints Row 3, it's Saints Row the Third, a deliberately clunky name that tells you everything you need to know. This game is going to be a little bit silly. I like Saints Row the Third, but that comes with a lot of caveats, because there's two ways of looking at Saints Row the Third: as a game and as a sequel. Saints Row the Third is a pretty good game that happens to be a sequel to one of my favourite games of all time, and that's a legacy that's very hard to ignore no matter how you look at it. I want to try and examine this game on its own merits, because there's plenty of them, and a lot of this game's flaws are only flaws when viewing it as a sequel. Saints Row the Third is lacking many features from the previous game, from simple things like some of the more fun activities, to extremely major and weird exclusions like a fluid day-night cycle. Does a game need a fluid day-night cycle? No, it doesn't, and there are some good reasons to use a cinematic framing instead. But is it weird to have one and then take it away between games? Yes it is. Does the game need height variation between the main characters? No, it's not necessary. It's not a feature that most people would probably even notice. But again, we had it at one time, and now we don't. That's weird. The question is, why have details like this been removed, and what exactly have they been replaced with? And that is a damn good question, if I do say so myself. So let's talk about defining a franchise. Let's talk about Saints Row the Third. If there's one theme to the story of Saints Row the Third, it's memes and references, and to set off that tone, the game doesn't begin with a dangerous street walk or a prison breakout, but with an opening crawl in the style of Star Wars to the music of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's a pretty perfect way to set the tone for the game. It immediately sets your expectations. There's not any thematic or narrative reason to start the game this way. Saints Row the Third is in no way an homage to Star Wars or to Space Odyssey, it's just a random joke. That's not an insult. Random jokes are at the core of Saints Row the Third, and some of them manage to land pretty well. The opening crawl explains what's happened since the events of Saints Row 2. The Saints have become worldwide superstars with their own clothing line, reality TV shows, and energy drinks, and that newfound fame is about to attract some unwanted attention. Why have the Saints decided to become celebrities? It's unclear. There's buried in there, I think, some kind of commentary on gangsta artists who go full Hollywood and lose their street cred, but why is that in there? I'm not sure. It's not really that important to the game, all things considered. It seems to be there to support the idea that the Saints have gotten soft and that they aren't really prepared for a new threat, but that idea is questionable when the plot actually gets going. Before we start playing, we get a second random joke, this time a reference to weird Japanese commercials, which I know it was a previous era, but those were a big internet thing in 2011. I'm not going to point all of these out, but in a strange sense, Saints Row the Third's sense of humour dates it as much, if not more so, to a certain time period than even the first game with its baggy jeans obsession. Finally, we get to the actual start of the game. Johnny Gat, the boss, a vain Hollywood actor type named Josh Burke, and a very different looking and sounding Shaundi are about to rob a bank, wearing big Johnny Gat mascot heads. I normally wouldn't go this detailed, but I'm pointing all of this out to enforce just how much whiplash there is if you're playing these games back to back. If you start this game right after Saints Row 2, then you cut from the boss coldly executing Dane Vogel to a Japanese energy drink commercial and an extremely silly bank heist. Of all the major differences between these two games, the tone is by far the majorest of them. Saints Row 2 was a silly world that everyone took seriously. Saints Row the Third is a silly world with even sillier people in it. As it turns out, the bank belongs to a multinational crime organisation known as the Syndicate, which is a bit like a multinational spy organisation being called the Agency. When you're caught by the police, their leader, a guy called Philippe Loren, takes you from the prison to his private jet. He's expanding into Stillwater, and he's going to be taking a 66% cut of all of your profits. Obviously, Obviously, you say no, and Johnny Gat literally rips the steel bolts out of the floor to escape. This results in shooting your way through the plane and diving out the back of the plane to catch Shondi through a truly ridiculous amount of falling crates and boxes, then throwing Shondi again, diving through the plane again, diving back out, and catching Shondi a second time, all while shooting other skydiving goons. Johnny Gat dies off screen and you land in the new setting of the game, Steelport, back at the bottom of the food chain once again. It's a lot. That's the trend of this game. It's a lot. Saints Row 2 was certainly an escalation of the first game, but Saints Row the Third is several steps beyond even that. If Saints Row 2 was aiming for a B-movie tonality with its action set pieces, then Saints Row the Third is the ridiculous stunts and cartoon physics of a modern blockbuster like Fast and Furious. This is just the start of the game. Things escalate from here. Giant Russian clone armies, zombie islands, laser-wielding paramilitary soldiers. The further you go into the game, the further and further away you get from any grounding in reality. Ridiculousness is not a bad direction to go in, but the fact that the game escalated so quickly and so jarringly from the last game is why some people don't consider it to be a real sequel. It's a very fundamentally video gamey tonality. If you're taking any of this seriously, then you're doing it wrong. To jump ahead for a minute and quote famous author Jane Austen on this game,
when the Saints made their presence known to the world in 2006, they were decried for being pretenders to the throne. The people were confused. Were the Saints sociopathic killing machines hell-bent on destruction? Or puckish rogues living a life of mirth and whimsy? The Saints needed clarity of purpose, and so the course was set. More fun, less mercy killing.
That's right, it all goes back to GTA. The answer to almost every question about this game's design, story, and even art style is GTA. During the development of Saints Row 2, a little game you may have heard of called Grand Theft Auto 4 came out and completely revitalized the GTA franchise. It was a reboot that put cinematic storytelling at the forefront, and with its episodic DLC system, still stands out as having one of the longest stories in the crime simulator genre. I personally prefer Saints Row 2 to GTA 4, but they were in direct competition and there's just no way around it. GTA 4 is not a completely serious game, it has its moments of silly humour in it, but it was trying to tell a much more serious story than any previous title in the series. A story of the American dream and the expectations of an immigrant coming to the free world versus the realities of that world. When it came to serious storytelling in the genre, GTA had already won, and the GTA clone label was extremely firmly rooted to the Saints Row series. As unfair as that label may have been, at the time that's just what they were. That's where we get this game. If Saints Row was going to stand any chance of escaping the GTA clone label, it had to do the opposite of what GTA was doing. Saints Row the Third defines itself in direct opposition to Grand Theft Auto 4. You can have your serious dissection of the American dream, or you can have fun.
Taking the tank, Kenzie. Really? Do you even know me? Of course we're taking the tank. This is so fucking cool. Burt fucking Reynolds? Come on, boy, faster!
Who else would keep this town running?
Oh, why do I do this? You'll have to get going.
What the fuck is that thing?
Something angry. Very angry.
Yeah, no offense, but you're kind of ridiculous.
The game's most iconic weapon is also the most symbolic of the game itself. This is the Penetrator. It's a giant pink dildo that you use like a baseball bat. This is extremely crass, a little bit tasteless, but also just so stupid that you can't possibly try and have a serious conversation about it. For obvious reasons, Saints Row the Third is an 18+, but to an even greater extent than even the first game, it has the tonality of a horny 13-year-old boy. However, where Saints Row 1 was an edgy 13-year-old with its constant N-word usage and tasteless restaurant names, Saints Row the Third is a lot more goofy with its approach to all of this. You never get the impression that it's including these elements with the intention of offending someone. You're not supposed to look at the gimp-drawn chariot shootout and think about how this is maybe an unhealthy representation of sex work, because it's just not a representation of sex work at all. It's made-up fantasy nonsense. It's not clever humour, it's exceptionally stupid humour, where the joke is just seeing what the most ridiculous thing they can actually put in the game is. This is where my personal issues start to come in, because on its own, this is a perfectly fine angle for the game to take, and from a marketing perspective, going all in on the stupid fun crime simulator is the correct thing to do. But this is just not my style of humour. Does the game get a couple chuckles out of me? Yes, it does. I'm not too big to admit that. But almost always when it does, it's the smaller character moments and not the wider nonsense of the actual script and the game world. Comedy is one of the most subjective forms of entertainment, and by far the one that ages the fastest. I think I've grown out of this game, and I can't really get back to a place where furries charging at you with floppy dildo bats gets anything more than an indulgent eye roll from me. And not gelling with the game's comedy is a big problem, because without the comedy, Saints Row the Third is no GTA 4 when it comes to storytelling. Structurally, Saints Row the Third has many surface-level similarities to the previous games. There's 3 gangs, each of them controls a region of the city, and you need to take it from them block for block. The twist this time is that each of the 3 gangs are in fact different branches of the same gang. There's the Deckers, a gang of cyberpunk hackers led by an 18-year-old super genius named Matt Miller. The Luchadors, a gang of, luchadors, led by a guy called Killbane. And then, possibly the most boring gang in any of these games, including the first game, the Morning Star, a gang of European dudes in suits led by Philippe Loren and his 2 assistants, the De Winter sisters, Viola and Kiki. Having all the gangs actually be the same gang is a change from the previous games, but not necessarily for the better, just for the different. It does give the game a more coherent enemy and a clearer objective, which goes into the biggest shift in the storytelling. There is no longer 3 distinct campaigns for each gang. You'll take down each of them one at a time in the order the script says, starting almost immediately with the Morning Star, by which I mean you crush Philippe Loren with a counterweight about 2 hours into the game. Revenge quest over. Except then Killbane blows up a bridge with Johnny's funeral procession, so it's time for Revenge Quest 2, this time with feeling. The story of Saints Row the Third is deliberately disorganised. Despite opening with Philippe Loren and the Morning Star, there are 2 true villains of the game. Killbane, who takes over the Syndicate after Loren's death, and a paramilitary anti-gang organisation, STAG, led by a guy called Cyrus Temple, who are introduced about a third of the way into the game. Of the 2, Cyrus is the more interesting villain. He's the only person in the game who takes everything completely seriously, no matter how stupid things get, and that makes him feel like a much more genuine threat than the cartoon villain antics of Killbane, who snaps his underlings' necks for using his real name. STAG also represents a much bigger threat than the Syndicate generally. They have advanced technology, they're government funded, and they have permission to do whatever is necessary. Fighting STAG feels like an uphill battle in a way that the Syndicate just doesn't. That presents an issue though, because the game systems are all built around a gang war, just like the previous games. Tone is one thing, but in a video game sequel, tone matters a hell of a lot less than mechanical lineage. And with Saints Row the Third, a lot of thought and effort was clearly put into figuring out what makes Saints Row mechanically interesting, more so than even the story. Almost every system in the series has been massively reworked, taking a lot of the same ideas, but mixing them and redistributing them with the goal of making the game more fun to play. For some areas, like combat, that's a massive improvement. There wasn't much to talk about with combat in the first 2 games. You aim your gun at the bad guys and shoot them before they shoot you. Here, combat has been given a massive overhaul to make it a much more engaging experience. The bedrock mechanics of aiming and shooting have been refined, but there's also a lot more variation in enemy design. You've got your regular thugs, but then each faction also has a specialist who'll mix up an encounter. The Morning Star have snipers, the Luchadors have grenadiers, and the Deckers have teleporting anime schoolgirls. As you build up notoriety with the gangs, these specialists will come out with more frequency, and eventually they'll start sending out the brutes as well. Massive bullet sponges who can come equipped with a minigun or a flamethrower. To counter them, you have a whole host of bigger and weirder weapons to bring along, all of which have an upgrade tree that can make them even more unique, with things like incendiary ammo or an attached grenade launcher. There's also tanks if you aren't actually looking for a challenge. These are positive changes. On a minute-to-minute basis, Saints Row the Third is a joy to get into random firefights with. The bigger and stranger changes, however, are systemic. Side activities and the respect system are both back, though they've both been massively reworked into very different systems. Respect is no longer needed to complete main story missions. Instead, it's a leveling system tied to a long list of purchasable upgrades. Everything from extra ammo and health to the types of guns your homies are using. The side activities are more directly integrated into the main story, with a new city takeover system that replaces the old idea of one neighbourhood per mission. Every insurance insurance fraud, mayhem, or store-bought will now take over a small block of the city, and every block owned will generate you a small amount of passive income every hour. Some of these are better integrated than others. I have no idea how driving around the city with a tiger is contributing to your war against the Syndicate, but that's the general idea. Every side activity is a contribution towards the fight. That has some strange side effects on the story because it means that taking over the city is now a side activity. It's no longer a big story moment when you take down a gang, because taking down the boss of the gang doesn't actually finish them off. Whatever random activity you do last is what finishes them off. Making the side activities more important to the story comes at the weird expense of making the actual gang war part of the game less important to the story. It becomes more of a traditional open world checklisting sort of experience. This remix also means there's less side activities overall. Instead of 6 levels of each activity, there's easy, medium, and hard, spread across the map and tied to their specific block. And because of the new respect leveling system, the rewards for doing these activities have been drastically reduced. There are still rewards, but they're almost entirely cosmetic and monetary. You still unlock the same things, just with the upgrade system middleman, which does provide the player more choice, technically, but it's also a slightly less compelling way to do it. Even though you're getting the same things as the previous games, the way you're getting them, buying them off a list instead of winning them as a reward, feels less impactful. One of the craziest things you can buy in the upgrades is City Takeover, in which you can auto-complete an entire district of the city automatically, skipping any of the gameplay you'd have to do to get there. I honestly don't know why they would include this. It's a play less game button. All of this to say, Saints Row III is a smaller game than either of the previous games, and it feels like a smaller game. Everything has been massively streamlined from previous entries to make for a more cinematic and more exciting experience. I like the old approach better, if that wasn't clear already, but that's exactly the problem I have talking about this game. These are not bad systems. They're fine. They function. They offer tons of player freedom, which is exactly the intention. They're only a negative in comparison to the way that Saints Row 2 handled things. A big point of criticism between the games is the changes to customization. Instead of having a layered clothing system of jackets, overshirts, and undershirts, the game simply has tops and bottoms, which offers less fine-tuning in your outfit, but there's also a ton of options to balance that out. This is a great customization system for any open-world game, except a sequel to Saints Row 2. Saints Row III leans heavily on caricature, with giant muscles and a bib slider that goes to infinity. This effect is lessened by the remaster, which, especially the faces, goes in a more realistic direction, but the game still has very cartoony proportions, which is especially noticeable in the way that hair is all modelled to flop around in big clumps. This is a fine art style to go for, and it fits the game well, but it's nothing like Saints Row 2, which was going for mostly realistic proportions. It's just a different game. Different enough to attract a new, bigger audience, but not so completely different that the comparisons are unwarranted, which, as a fan of the second game and as someone trying to give a fair critique in retrospective, leaves me in a tight spot. Most people started on Saints Row III. This is what the franchise is to them, with its cartoonish stylings and crass over-the-top humour. And it's not like the first 2 games didn't have that. They weren't going for serious. It's more like this game was about 4 steps ahead of where that escalation would naturally go. Saints Row 1 was a standard street gang story with some crass, edgy jokes thrown around the open world for flavour. Saints Row 2 was a weirder gang story with bike ninjas and voodoo shamans that took all of its video game weirdness completely seriously. Saints Row III's plot, in comparison, really doesn't matter at all, and none of the characters, especially the boss, take it seriously. It's blatantly a way to string together cool action sequences or interesting game design challenges and arenas. The Saints are theoretically in this for revenge, but you know, and the game knows, that you're both really here for fun, and so fun is what it strives to deliver. Infiltrating and then blowing up an aircraft carrier while having plastic surgery done to look like the commander, entering cyberspace to do a battle with an anime edgelord dragon, fighting off wrestlers with a chainsaw in front of a live audience, turning one of the game's islands into a zombie apocalypse just for fun. None of this is supposed to provoke any deep emotions. There's no character growth or arcs. Everyone ends the game in pretty much exactly the same place they started it. Or they're dead. More fun, less mercy killings really is the driving design philosophy. And Obviously, right? That's clearly the correct direction to go in. Even I expressed some discomfort with the dark heaviness of the mercy killing scene in Saints Row 2. Moving in a less serious direction makes sense, and it went down well, and the problem here is me, not the game. I love a story I can dig into and analyse, really sink my teeth into, and Saints Row III is a game that at every possible moment is telling you not to think too hard about this. For example, Saints Row III will always be directly tied to the song Power by Kanye West. It played all over the game's big CGI reveal trailer, and it plays at a pivotal moment early in the game. I'm gonna get so much shit from Kanye West fans over this, but whatever, he's a fascist. Power is not a deep song, it's just a song about how Kanye is awesome and all of his haters can kiss his ass. And that's why it's perfect for this game. They're as meaningful as each other. Saints Row III is about how awesome the player is and forcing all of the haters to kiss your ass. It's in the most blunt way possible a power fantasy. The boss is basically a superhero with the amount of absolutely insane things they do over the course of the game. And the game is, frankly, closer to a superhero simulator than it is to a crime simulator with how it plays. And that's fine. Saints Row III doesn't want to be anything more than dumb fun, and once you settle into that, you can start enjoying the ride. There's just one issue. For everything I've said about how this game discourages you from taking anything seriously, there's one thing I can't ignore. This isn't just a power fantasy, it's a male power fantasy. Saints Row III was released in late 2011, which puts it right at the tail end of the pre-Gamergate era, when the entire industry had to have a look at itself and the culture it had been creating. The very next year, Anita Sarkeesian put out her infamous Kickstarter for her show, Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, which at the time was a disaster, obviously, but I think may go down as one of the most important pieces of game media in history. More for what it represents than what it says. Honestly, it's kind of boring to actually watch. It's important for the backlash because it laid bare the massive problem of sexism both within the games industry and amongst a terrifyingly large majority of gamers. I was in high school at the time it was going around, and I don't even remember how I learned the name Anita Sarkeesian. I just knew she was a bad person, she was a hypocrite, a thief, she was trying to destroy the games industry with some perverted version of feminism. It wasn't until years later that I actually learned who she was and what she had actually done that was so vile, and to modern ears, the things she says are so obvious that Tropes vs. Women in Video Games seems almost redundant. Doesn't everyone just get why this is bad? Well, no, they don't. And Saints Row III is almost a poster child for exactly why. Saints Row III is a game written by men, for men. You can play as a woman, as you can see I did, but the game actually genders the boss in several cutscenes as a man that doesn't make sense if you're playing a woman, like calling them a fanboy, for example. Even if you can play as a woman, it's assumed that the player is a man, and if they're playing as a woman, then it's probably just for titillation, hence the boob slider to infinity and the extremely overactive booby jiggle physics. And that is a trend across the whole game. The female characters are certainly more developed in Saints Row 1, but they all exist to be appealing to a male audience in a way that male characters clearly aren't supposed to be the opposite. The game does the same as Tara Patrick in the last game, casting a famous porn star in the game for marketing purposes. This time Sasha Grey as Viola de Winter. And while I'll grant that she's a much deeper character than Tara Patrick the microbiologist, she's exactly the archetype of this strong female character as written by men. She's smart, sexy, badass, angry, and oh yeah, she runs the sex trafficking operations in the city. This game is absolutely full of sex workers, all of them women, and all of them nothing more than props. There's literally a mission where you rescue them from a shipping container just to pile them back into another shipping container and put them to work for you instead. For the most part, Saints Row 2 steered clear of the sex industry, but Saints Row 3 dives way back in a way that's honestly uncomfortable. It's not that there's anything wrong with depicting prostitution in your game, it just helps when you treat the people doing it as people and not as props. It's all so obviously one-sided. Female sexuality in the game is all over the place. It's even incorporated into the design of the open world itself with sexy women lampposts, which may just be the most on-the-nose thing I've ever seen. While male sexuality is always presented as a joke, the pink floppy dildo bats, or Zemo strung up on that gimp chariot we mentioned before. In fact, that's even more uncomfortable because he was in that position against his will, and it really seems like he spent the last few years engineers being raped repeatedly in a dungeon, but the game just sort of blazes right past that because Zemos is a sex pest anyway, so it's fine. It's all just for the lols. There's another mission where Zemos sells the boss as a sex slave at an auction to infiltrate the BDSM club, and the player wakes up totally naked and drugged. This is supposed to be funny, but if you're playing as a female boss especially, it's just really, really not. This kind of thing doesn't come from a place of malice, it comes from a place of ignorance. Being drugged and stripped while you break prostitutes out of dark cages is the kind of experience you can only find funny if you don't fully process that this is a real thing that a horrifying amount of women have actually had to go through. I'm not saying that no women could have fun with this game, but it certainly wasn't made for them. Let's consider the two other major female characters in the game. Kinsey Kensington seems like she should be the exception. She's a nerdy former CIA hacker whose design is deliberately unsexualized. Of the three female leads, she has the most to do and generally has the best lines. Yet every single turn the game goes to great lengths to make her sexuality a point of interest anyway. Literally one of the first things she says in the game is what her BDSM safe word is. Just so you know that even if she doesn't look typically sexual, she's into kinky sex stuff. She's still there to cater to a male audience, in some ways even more so. She's the kind of girl that the target audience thinks they could actually score with. She's there for the dudes who are more into hashtag gamer girls. But the most disappointing by far is Shaundi. Shaundi is so different to how she was in Saints Row 2 that she's basically an entirely different character. In fact, that's made literal in Saints Row 4. The change in voice actor is part of it, but it's her personality that's completely changed. She's gone from a live and let live hippie stoner type to a high-strung, angry badass. She's basically the same as Viola de Winter, but slightly less interesting. It's the same issue as Viola, where strong female character means sexy, badass, and angry. She's so angry all of the time. The game uncritically associates femininity with weakness constantly.
Burke's right. We traded our dicks in for pussies. Seriously.
Put in your tampons and let's do this.
That's exactly where this idea of a strong female character comes from. A strong female character is one who acts to deny her femininity, but they do so in a way that's still sexy for a male viewer. It's not like she started bulking up and wearing combat slacks. She's still dressed up like a supermodel, but with absolutely none of the character traits of a supermodel. Shaundi was a much, much stronger character in the second game exactly because she embraced femininity. She was open about her sexuality in a really casual way that actually was empowering, and she made her contribution to the team without relying exclusively on violence. Here, her primary motivation is being one of the big boys, but that doesn't stop the game from kidnapping her twice, because even if she can become more badass, she can't become badass enough to not get damseled for player motivation's sake. The characters are generally pretty condescending towards Shaundi for trying to be more active in the fight, and then the game just proves them right by having her be kidnapped. Shaundi also gets kidnapped twice in Saints Row 2, but she's never characterized as wanting to be a fighter in Saints Row 2, so it doesn't clash as hard with her role in the story. The game is not blatantly sexist. It's not like Saints Row 1 in that way. They're clearly trying to avoid some of the most terrible tropes of women in games, but in doing so, they're just falling into different tropes. They're diversifying the cast, adding more women, but they're still doing so while only catering to a very specific target demographic, the demographic of teenage boys and older man-children who were the face of gamers at the time. The assumption is that women aren't into this sort of game, but that's a real self-fulfilling prophecy. They're not into these games because they feel so deliberately excluded from everything the game is doing. And look, I am the target demographic. I like looking at attractive women. I'm sure you can get why I would complain about this as a woke social justice type, but that really isn't why this bothers me. I'm sick of being targeted. It's such a small-minded idea of what entertainment for boys is. Sexy women and big explosions. Well, maybe I want a little more than that in my entertainment, thank you. Maybe staring at big tits isn't all there is to my enjoyment of a piece of media. And in the decades since then, the games industry has actually caught up with that and generally presents more mature stories with more fully fleshed out female casts. Even the writer of most of the Saints Row games, Steve Jaros, came out a few years later to say that he agreed with everything Anita Sarkeesian was saying, so I don't feel too bad about laying it on thick on the problems in this game. I mentioned that Shaundi is kidnapped twice, right? Well, the first time is when you blow up that aircraft carrier. The second time is at the end of the game, and that's a whole separate batch of weirdness this game has. Throughout the game, you'll occasionally be given a choice between two actions. For example, the first one is if you want to blow up Loren's tower after you kill him. These choices are usually entirely mechanics-based. Do you want cash now, or do you want a new passive income source? But the differences are minor, so it's usually an inconsequential choice in the grand scheme of things. That has one major exception. At the end of the game, during a firefight between all three factions, you're given a choice of heavy consequence. Shaundi and Viola have been kidnapped by Stag, and they're going to blow up the big statue and frame the Saints as a public menace. Also, Killbane is escaping, and you've got one chance to catch him. You can only do one or the other, and each choice will take you to a different ending. I find this choice so interesting that it was actually the topic of one of my first video essays, but I'm better at this now, so let's revisit it, shall we? This is a bad choice because it's at odds with the very ideas of the game. What reason does anyone have to vengefully go after Killbane? Sure, if you get the opportunity to kill him, do it. He's a bit of a dick. But at the expense of two of the game's main characters, he's just not worth it. He's no longer a threat. He's running away. The only reason to go after him now is pure spite. But spite was never the emotion that the game was going for. It was going for fun, and fun says, don't let your friends die. It's weird then that the Kill Killbane ending is the way more interesting choice, both as a story and from a gameplay perspective. If you save Shaundi, then the ending totally fizzles out. Stag are called off because they get caught trying to blow up a national monument, and the final mission of the game is Gangstas In Space, a parody of 1950s sci-fi, and also, because of course, another Red Faction reference. Killbane has gone to Mars, and the space hero Saints must stop him from unleashing an army to destroy the Earth, but at what cost? It's obviously revealed to be a movie that the boss is acting in, and that's the final note of the story. It's really weird and has nothing to do with the plot of the game. You don't even see the characters you rescued. If, on the other hand, you go after Killbane, then there's a quiet scene where the boss thinks on the decision. It's honestly pretty good, one of the only tonally quiet and dark moments in the whole game. Because Stag's plan works, they finally get permission to bring in the Daedalus, something Cyrus has been asking permission to use for the whole game, and it turns out it's a giant helicarrier with mounted machine guns that starts raining down fire on the city. You fly up and plant bombs all over it, ending with a fight against Cyrus. It's a way better ending for the game, a big dramatic escalation of everything that's happened so far, and the peak of the action set piece design. It's just also the ending where you let 3 people die for basically no reason. Having multiple endings is a fun idea, but really I don't understand why this game needed a multiple choice ending other than the novelty of having one. Oh, it's because GTA 4 had multiple endings, isn't it? That's always the answer. Just because you can have multiple endings to a game doesn't mean you should. And while I've been pretty insistent that the plot of this game doesn't really matter, if there's one consistent theme, it's camaraderie. Saints Row III puts in a lot of time to make the Saints feel like a big, weird friend group, and so the ending where you forsake that friendship in favour of revenge makes absolutely no sense, even if it is the better ending mechanically. Because the moments of Saints Row III that really stick with me, that I genuinely, uncritically enjoy, are the small character moments. I like the cast in Saints Row 2, but I love them in Saints Row III. Yes, the way the women are written is annoying a lot of the time, but when a personality shines through, it is endearing. The Saints have been massively expanded in this game with all different shapes and sizes of people who all bounce off each other in interesting ways. A feature I love is when you take them out in the open world, they'll have little conversations with each other, which gives you some insight into their relationships, and makes it properly feel like they all know each other, not just you. There's the big Russian KGB agent Oleg, Zimos, the elder statesman of pimps, with a voice synthesizer that makes him always talk in song. Kinsey is the smartest person in the room and constantly annoyed about it. Angel, Killbane's former partner, who's also a crazy extreme sports type, voiced by Hulk Hogan for some reason. Viola is the turncoat nobody's sure they can trust. And of course, Pierce and Shaundi as the old friends you can always rely on. The boss has been softened a lot between games into someone you can actually believe would have friends. Female voice one is always my favourite because it's Laura Bailey, and she plays the role in a bereaved mum sort of way, affectionately calling everyone sweetie. My favourite moment in the game isn't even in a cutscene or a shootout or an action set piece. Early on, when you're just doing the tutorial missions and familiarising yourself with the new setting, the boss and Pierce start singing along to the radio. Neither of them are particularly in tune, but they're having an absolute blast, laughing and giggling about it, and it just feels really genuine.
I got a dimension, and I can still get high, you know it. I can play the guitar like a motherfucking riot. That's the one.
When the game has spent its entire runtime building up relationships that feel genuinely like a weird found family, it makes no sense not to rescue members of that family. It's something the boss of Saints Row 2 might do, but not this one. The game encourages you to do both anyway. After you complete the final mission, it opens up again so you can see the other choice. It's just a weird, muddled place to end the game, because it's not really supposed to be the end of the game anyway, just the end of the story. By the time you reach this, you've probably got hours of open world messing around to go. And maybe open world mayhem is the best place to end the game. Just messing around until you get bored is the true narrative of the game anyway. The game had an ungodly amount of DLC packs, and most of them were just to expand this very part of the game. More guns, more vehicles, weirder cosmetic items, more and more random stuff to throw into your toolbox. Amongst all of that though, there were 3 more substantial content packs, and for the most part they serve as even further escalations of the chaotic fun that this game is trying to achieve.
I'm gonna kill that son of a bitch. I'm gonna kill that son of a bitch. I'm gonna kill that son of a bitch. Oh, that's weird.
The first of these DLCs is a kind of follow-up to the Gangstas In Space ending called Gangstas In Space, funnily enough, and it's more of the same idea where the things you're doing aren't actually real, they're just actions in a movie, and the game even adds cinematic black bars when the scenes are filming. The plot revolves around the rivalry between the obnoxious director Jen and your co-star in the alien makeup, Jenny, with the joke being that the boss is actually a terrible actor, but Jen always praises them and insults Jenny despite her being much better. It's a joke that gets tired very quickly. What's more interesting is how the DLC serves as a kind of meta-commentary of Saints Row III itself. All of the action in the DLC is pre-scripted and designed to be deliberately obvious and silly. You're shooting a B-movie, but the gameplay hasn't actually changed at all. You're still shooting people in the same way you have been the whole game. And eventually it's revealed that you actually are shooting real extras because they're cheaper than paying for drones. The meta-commentary is that the whole game is like this. There's really no meaningful difference between the fake shootout you do at the military base for the cameras and the real shootout you do at the military base in the real game. The whole game has been designed to be like a playable movie. This DLC just forces you to think about that. Besides that, it is truly an incredibly superfluous bit of extra content with absolutely no meaningful connection back to the base game. This version of Gangstas In Space with its alien space princesses and Earth invasion seems to have nothing to do with the Gangstas In Space about Killbane on Mars. The DLC ends when Jenny has a total breakdown and snaps at the director, flying the spaceship right into him and killing him, which is a satisfying enough ending because he's a real annoying asshole. But the best part of the whole DLC is probably the final line.
So, guess that's a wrap.
It's short and sweet, certainly, but I'm still puzzling out why it was actually made. Saints Row III came out of an era in gaming I like to call the DLC tidal wave, where every game had just an ungodly amount of DLC content added, mostly cosmetic, but also a whole lot of weird little extras like this that seemingly only exist for the sake of existing. I honestly think I would have enjoyed it more without the meta-movie elements if I was just playing through the movie itself. I mean, really, if we've already got zombies and laser guns, why not aliens? 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 Why not aliens?
Hello, sports fans, and welcome to the craziest, wildest, bloodiest extravaganza outside of Juarez, Genkibowl VII.
The second major DLC pack doesn't actually add any new missions, but instead adds a pile of extra side activities all themed around a returning character from the base game, Professor Genki. Professor Genki's super ethical reality climax is another one of those haha, isn't Japan so funny and weird things in the base game where it's this hyper-violent game show that uses all this weird cutesy language while you're doing it. Genki himself is a large Cheshire cat looking guy wearing a lab coat. Overall, Saints Row III avoids most criticisms about racism or cultural appropriation by just making the game more white generally. All of the villains are white, all but one of the new saints are white. That causes a bit of weirdness when all of the luchadors in the game are beefy white guys and not Mexicans, but that's a lot less uncomfortable than whatever the hell is going on with Professor Genki here. I can't sit here and tell you that Japanese game shows aren't weird to my Western eyes, but Genki's whole deal seems to borrow the aesthetics, energy, and graphics from that kind of show without any real examination of if it's okay to include other cultures' entertainment purely because you think it's funny and weird. It's not offensive, that's not what I'm trying to argue. Just like with the depictions of women in the game, it doesn't come from a place of malice, but of ignorance. It's the impression of Japanese reality television from people who clearly only actually know about it from watching the highlight reels on YouTube. Genkibowl VII's new activities are each themed around one of the Genki girls, scantily clad animal-themed mascots. I guess. There's Angry Tiger's Apocalypse Genki, which is mostly just a slight remix of Super Ethical Reality Climax. Sexy Kitten's Yarngasm, which seems to be a reference to Katamari Damacy as you roll around a big ball of yarn causing chaos. And then Sad Panda's Sky Blazing has you diving through rings of fire, occasionally landing on rooftops to chainsaw some lesser mascots. It's the weird, crass, and random style of humour that the game is going for brought to a boiling point. The only difference is it's using Japanese culture to accentuate that weirdness and give it a foreign edge. That's kind of uncomfortable, but the bigger issue for me is that I just don't find it that funny. Random weirdness can only carry you so far, and here at the tail end of Saints Row III, random weirdness is really starting to overstay its welcome. Random only stays random as long as you can no longer predict it.
It was a dark and stormy night. The heavens wept as I defiled Mother Nature.
Johnny, we're about to jump!
Right on. I'll see you in still.
Johnny?
They failed you, Johnny. But I never will. I'm your #1 fan.
The final DLC is also the perfect place to end this video because it's so highly representative of the direction of the franchise going forward. It's called The Trouble with Clones. After his death in the base game, a kid named Jimmy set out to clone Gat and bring him back to life. He was successful, but the clone was angry and confused and also gigantic and ran off, so it's up to you, Jimmy, and Pierce to get Gat back home. I didn't talk much about Johnny Gat's death because really there's not lots to say. It happens very early in the game, in a strange way that's kind of supposed to keep you wondering if he's actually dead, which it's revealed by the end of the game that he probably is, until they reverse that in the next game. Gat is the last real holdover from the first game, and so symbolically I'm actually fine with killing him off. I like Johnny, he's fun, but he's also pretty much the same character as the boss. They serve a kind of dual function as being the ultimate badass. And in a game this dedicated to making the player the biggest badass in the room, Johnny Gat just doesn't fit. This DLC's approach to Gat honestly reminds me more than anything else of Sir Hammerlock's Big Game Hunt, the third DLC of Borderlands 2. That's also a story of a nerdy weirdo trying to bring back a famous character from the base game as increasingly weird clones. And it's also symbolic of each series' approach to that character going forward. For better or worse, Johnny Gat is the face of Saints Row, more so than the boss because he's a clearly defined character, and that's why they couldn't leave him dead. Just like Jimmy. Jimmy is the other half of this DLC, and Jimmy sucks. He sucks so much. He's deliberately written to be as annoying as possible, and ekes out every line in the most over-exaggerated nerd voice I've ever heard. He also narrates over the entire DLC, so he's never not talking, and I think he may actually have a more annoying voice than me, and if the comments are anything to go by, that's quite a feat.
Having arrived just in time to save the king from certain death, the three set out on a chase to the metropolis of Steelport in search of their clone twin. Amazed by the device built for such a purpose, they asked for an explanation on how it works.
Jimmy is the embodiment of a kind of aggressive self-nerd hatred. Sure, player, the game says, you're an awkward nerd looking at big boobs on your Xbox 360, but you're not this fucking guy. You're not this much of a loser. The whole thing plays out as a kind of Frankenstein parody. Jimmy even makes up a clone of Aisha to try and calm Big Johnny down, but then she gets blown up. The last mission is the most interesting though, because it gives you superpowers. Jimmy irradiated a can of Saints Flow energy drink and you get super speed, super punches, and the ability to throw fireballs. I already said the gameplay's more like a superhero game, so why not just make it official? It's probably the most fun part of any of the 3 DLCs. A little bit clunky, sure, but still a ton of fun. You can see exactly right here where the idea of Saints Row 4 began. The game ends in a classic superhero setting. Johnny and Pierce are trapped on the bridge and you have to fight off the military to save them, ending with the new Johnny joining the Saints once again. Jimmy tells us how the Saints and their new allies will have to always be wary of new dangers, and ends us on a question mark. But thankfully, this is the last time we ever have to see Jimmy again. No question about that. Saints Row the Third is far from my ideal game. It's doing a lot of things, and not all of them work for me. But I respect it. It took a brand that had been thoroughly tarnished by an unfair label and carved out a place for itself that's truly unique on the gaming landscape. There's truly no other game like Saints Row the Third, not even in the rest of the Saints Row series. We're also, and I'm sure you know this, teetering on the edge of an abyss, aren't we? We both know what comes next. And sure, there have been some signs that things could go in a stranger direction, but how exactly do we go from gang wars to the president fighting aliens in the Matrix? Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see, won't we?
Not bad. You could be a weatherman or some shit.
I may have laid it on a little thick.
You did just create a city-state.
Good point. Hey, that reminds me. This place is gonna need a new mayor. How do you feel about public office?
It's a horrible idea. I'm in.
Then let's get to work.
Thank you very much for watching, and a very special thank you to my patrons for supporting the things I do. If you'd like to see your name up here or get access to exclusive Patreon videos, you can find the link in the description below, as well as a like, a comment, a share, and a subscribe. You can find the rest of my Saints Row videos here, both past and future, or if you're looking for something a bit different, why not check out this video on the romantic subplot of Jedi Survivor, because it's really, really good and I can't get it out of my head.